Admiral Scheer was originally labeled a Deutschland-class heavy cruiser, commonly known as a pocket battleship, which belonged to Nazi Germany's Kriegsmarine before and during World War II. She took her name from Admiral Reinhard Scheer, a German naval commander of the famed Battle of Jutland in 1916. Her keel laying happened in June 1931 at the Reichsmarine Maywerft in Wilhelmshaven, and by November 1934, she was finished and ready to enter service. Initially, the German Navy classified her as a Panzerschiff, meaning armored ship. But around February 1940, she and her sister vessels were reclassified as heavy cruisers to align with evolving naval terminology. Although the Treaty of Versailles stipulated that new German warships stay under 10,000 long tons, Admiral Scheer ultimately surpassed that limit when fully loaded. Her true weight hovered around 17,000 short tons, despite official numbers claiming she stayed within legal confines. Sporting 6 11-inch guns arranged in 2 triple turrets, one forward and one aft, Admiral Scheer could unleash a formidable barrage on any cruiser she might encounter, especially if that cruiser was incapable of matching her raw firepower. Furthermore, her maximum speed of roughly 32 miles per hour left few Allied ships capable of both catching and overpowering her. In the years leading up to World War II, Admiral Scheer saw significant action, including deployments in the Spanish Civil War. During one memorable event, she carried out a bombardment of the port of Almeria in response to an attack against her sister ship, Deutschland. When global conflict erupted in 1939, Admiral Scheer embarked on one of the most successful commerce raiding missions among all German capital ships. Venturing deep into the southern Atlantic and making a short trip into the Indian Ocean, she systematically targeted Allied merchant vessels. By the time her mission concluded, she had sunk well over 100,000 gross register tons of shipping, cementing her place in history as a highly effective surface raider. Later, her journeys took her northward to Norwegian waters, where she threatened Allied convoys supplying the Soviet Union. She participated in an unsuccessful attack on convoy PQ-17 and later conducted Operation Wonderland, a sortie into the Kara Sea aimed at disrupting Soviet traffic. The final months of Admiral Scheer's life saw her reduced to a training vessel and eventually artillery support against Soviet ground forces. In spring 1945, she visited Kiel for repairs, only to be capsized by bombs during a massive British air raid on the 9th of April. Much of her wreck was left on site, partially scrapped, and eventually buried when the Kiel dockyard was filled in after the war. In 2024, a dedicated archaeological team employed reflection seismology to locate most of the remains of Admiral Scheer under a former Navy arsenal parking lot, an astonishing find for maritime historians. Design and capabilities. The Admiral Scheer stretched approximately 610 feet long and measured about 70 feet across at her widest point. She drew nearly 24 feet of water under a standard load. Despite Germany's official statements that she conformed to the Treaty of Versailles' 10,000 long-ton guideline, her true full displacement soared closer to 17,000 short tons. These extra tons allowed her to carry more armor, heavier firepower, and ample fuel. Her propulsion came from 4 sets of 9-cylinder, double-acting 2-stroke diesel engines built by man. When fully operational, they could generate about 53,000 shaft horsepower, propelling the ship to 28 knots, equivalent to roughly 32 miles per hour. Cruising at 20 knots, which translates to about 23 miles per hour, she possessed an impressive range of more than 10,000 miles, letting her roam vast stretches of ocean on a single fueling. Her normal complement started at around 33 officers and close to 600 enlisted men, but as the ship underwent modifications, her crew numbers swelled to over 1,000. Her main batteries consisted of 6 11-inch SKC-28 guns mounted in 2 triple turrets. Each turret sat either at the front or rear of the central superstructure, providing hefty striking power. The secondary armament centered on 8 5.9-inch guns placed in single mounts near the ship's midsection. For anti-air defense, Admiral Scheer carried a combination of 88mm, 37mm, and 20mm weapons in both single and multi-gun mounts. As technology progressed through the war, her anti-air arsenal underwent substantial revamping, exchanging older guns for more robust 4.1-inch cannons in twin mounts and adding additional 20mm and 37mm guns to protect against Allied aircraft. For torpedoes, Admiral Scheer had two quadruple 21-inch launchers fixed on her stern deck, which could threaten enemy warships and even merchant vessels that strayed too close. Early on, Admiral Scheer operated one Heinkel He-60 seaplane and used a catapult for launch and recovery. At times, different seaplane models joined the mix as the war progressed, improving her scouting and targeting. In terms of armor, her belt ranged from about 2 to 3 inches thick. The main armored deck reached around 1.8 inches in thickness, and her gun turrets boasted over 5 inches of frontal plating. Radar technology was evolving during the war, so Admiral Scheer initially carried a basic FMG-39 set. Later upgrades included the FMG-40 and FUMO-26 systems, aimed at detecting surface targets and guiding anti-air fire. Though not as sophisticated as Allied radar networks, this technology still afforded her a dangerous edge, especially against unprepared opponents. Early service and Spanish Civil War involvement. Germany's Reichsmarine commissioned Admiral Scheer after several political disputes within the Reichstag. By June 1931, work began on her hull, identified as construction number 123 at the Wilhelmshaven shipyard. She officially launched in April 1933, with Marianne Besserer, the daughter of Admiral Reinhard Scheer, serving as her sponsor. Roughly a year and a half later, in November 1934, the ship joined the fleet. Captain zur See Wilhelm Marschall became her first commanding officer, and the ship spent that winter completing trials and training exercises. By 1935, modifications like a new catapult and refined aircraft handling equipment were added, which helped manage seaplane operations in rough waters. Under a series of commanding officers, Admiral Scheer undertook voyages around Europe, including to Madeira and the Baltic region. Soon after, conflict in Spain offered her an unexpected stage. Germany, along with other European powers, announced a non-intervention policy during the Spanish Civil War. Yet Admiral Scheer found herself off the Republican coast, policing the flow of international arms and occasionally offering protection to nationalist-leaning shipments. One of the most dramatic moments occurred after her sister ship, Deutschland, suffered an aerial attack. As retaliation, Admiral Scheer bombarded the Spanish port of Almeria on May 31, 1937. This came exactly on the anniversary of the Battle of Jutland, adding a symbolic note to the operation. She later returned to her home port, then redeployed to the Mediterranean for a short while longer. World War II outbreak and refit. When World War II erupted in September 1939, Admiral Scheer sat at anchor near Wilhelmshaven alongside the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper. Just days into the war, British Bristol Blenheim bombers attacked. Her anti-air gunners managed to shoot down several planes, and while a few bombs fell near the vessel, one even striking the deck but failing to explode, she escaped without severe damage. Afterward, she spent time undergoing upgrades, including the replacement of her command tower and the fitting of a new raked clipper bow, improving her sea handling and stability. Germany's naval command also changed her designation from Panzerschiff to heavy cruiser to match classification norms. While undergoing maintenance, her sister ships had already ventured into the Atlantic to raid Allied convoys. By late July 1940, Admiral Scheer concluded her refit and looked poised to embark on what would become one of the most successful commerce raids by a German warship during the entire conflict. Atlantic commerce raiding. In October 1940, Admiral Scheer took advantage of a dark, moonless night to slip into the open Atlantic through the Denmark Strait, evading Allied patrols. Her big opportunity came on November 5, 1940, upon intercepting a convoy identified by her radio team. Convoy HX-84 sailed from Halifax, escorting essential resources to Britain. Admiral Scheer's seaplane scouted ahead, locating the convoy. Only one armed merchant cruiser, HMS Jervis Bay, stood guard. Courageously, Jervis Bay laid down smoke and charged Admiral Scheer, trying to save the scattered transport ships. Though Jervis Bay was quickly sunk, her sacrifice allowed most convoy vessels to escape. Admiral Scheer managed to sink 5 ships out of 37, plus an additional vessel taken out later by German aircraft. Continuing her hunt, Admiral Scheer prowled the Atlantic, capturing or destroying Allied merchant vessels. At one point, she deliberately let a distress signal slip through from the refrigerator ship Duquesa to lure British warships away from another German raider, Admiral Hipper. This diversion proved somewhat successful, as British carriers and cruisers set off on a wild chase, failing to snare Admiral Scheer. By Christmas 1940, Admiral Scheer found herself in the mid-Atlantic, not far from the remote island of Tristan da Cunha. Early the following year, she pushed into the Indian Ocean, linking up with auxiliary cruisers like Atlantis and supply ships for refueling and coordination. She added more victories to her tally, sinking multiple steamers and capturing tanker ships. Eventually, though, British forces began to close in, forcing Admiral Scheer to slip back toward the Atlantic. And by late March 1941, she dashed past Allied patrols through the Denmark Strait. She arrived safely in Bergen, Norway, and then moved on to Kiel at the beginning of April. Over the course of this remarkable foray, Admiral Scheer cruised more than 46,000 nautical miles, sinking 17 merchant ships for over 100,000 gross registered tons, a record for any German capital surface raider. However, the sinking of the battleship Bismarck in May 1941 had dire repercussions for Germany's supply ship network in the Atlantic, severely limiting Admiral Scheer's ability to carry out further extended raids. Operations in Norway and the Arctic. By early 1942, Germany had shifted focus to the Arctic supply lines heading to the Soviet Union. Admiral Scheer and other major warships, like Prince Eugen, steamed north to Norwegian fjords. They anchored among imposing mountains and ice-laden waters, attempting to intercept Allied convoys delivering crucial supplies to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. In July 1942, Admiral Scheer joined her sister ship Lutzow, along with battleships and destroyers, in Operation Russelsprung. Their target, convoy PQ-17, was well defended, but confusion and caution on the Allied side led to the convoy scattering, leaving many ships vulnerable to German U-boats and aircraft. A series of navigational mishaps, however, caused Admiral Scheer's partner Lutzow to run aground, forcing them to abort any surface engagement. Still, Admiral Scheer remained in Norwegian waters for Operation Wonderland in August 1942, aimed at pushing into the Kara Sea to strike Soviet shipping and installations. Navigating around the northern tip of Novaya Zemlya, the cruiser dealt with thick ice. On August 25th, Admiral Scheer encountered the Soviet icebreaker Sibiryakov. After a fierce shelling, Sibiryakov was sunk, but not before sending out a distress call that compromised Admiral Scheer's surprise. Nevertheless, the cruiser pressed onward, damaging port facilities at Dixon on August 27th. Shore batteries pushed back fiercely, and after evaluating the risk, the commander decided to turn back. Admirals in Berlin saw limited tangible results from Wonderland, although it demonstrated the Kriegsmarine's willingness to operate in extreme conditions. Come October 1942, Admiral Scheer departed Altafjord along with the battleship Tirpitz and several destroyers, but ended up returning south by year's end. She narrowly escaped bomb damage on more than one occasion, yet even minor hits highlighted growing Allied air superiority. By 1943, Admiral Scheer withdrew for an overhaul in Wilhelmshaven, then moved to Swinemünde to avoid Allied aerial raids on more exposed ports. She spent much of that year as part of Germany's fleet training group. Final role in the Baltic. In April 1944, Kapitän zur See Ernst Ludwig Thienemann took command of Admiral Scheer. Late that year, the cruiser returned to combat duty in the Baltic, supporting German troops. In November, she, along with destroyers and torpedo boats, provided covering fire around the island of Ussel. Soviet aircraft launched numerous raids, but the heavy anti-air defenses fended them off. Admiral Scheer's floatplane, however, was shot down. Despite the losses, the Navy successfully evacuated thousands of soldiers from the island. By early 1945, the German situation was desperate. Admiral Scheer, joined by several smaller escorts, hammered Soviet positions near Samland, hoping to slow the Red Army's advance toward East Prussia. Her main guns were worn down, and by March 1945, she headed to Kiel for essential repairs. Unable to navigate certain minefields, she paused at Swinemünde to offload hundreds of civilian refugees and wounded soldiers. Despite her battered condition, she shelled Soviet frontline positions until she ran out of ammunition, then finally made her way to Kiel on March 18th. As her aft turret received fresh gun barrels in early April 1945, the majority of her crew was housed ashore. Unfortunately for Admiral Scheer, a massive British bombing raid on April 9th turned Kiel's harbor into a firestorm. Several bombs struck the ship, causing her to capsize. Some partial scrapping occurred after Germany's capitulation, but a sizable portion of the hull was later buried when the dockyard area was filled with rubble from wartime destruction. The exact count of casualties during the raid remains unknown, yet the legend of Admiral Scheer endured. Jump ahead nearly 80 years to 2024. An industrious team of archaeologists and geophysicists used reflection seismology to probe beneath a parking lot in Kiel. They confirmed that around 70% of Admiral Scheer's remains, including her main guns and large sections of superstructure, still lie hidden underground, an enduring testament to a complex and turbulent era. Admiral Scheer's story is more than a naval chronicle. It is a gateway into lesser-known World War II events that shaped the outcome of global conflict. If you found this dive into maritime history intriguing, consider sharing it with a fellow enthusiast who loves uncovering the mysteries beneath the waves. Follow along for more in-depth looks at forgotten battles, daring sea raids, and the personal stories behind the steel hulls. Join our journey into untold history by tapping that subscribe button. You won't want to miss our next story.